The BP oil spill is being called the worst environmental disaster in U.S. history. To better understand the impact of the spill and its environmental, economic, and social costs, Access Minnesota talks with David Pello, a sociology professor at the University of Minnesota who specializes in environmental justice. But first, University Geology professor Justin Revenaugh explains what BP is doing to try and stop the leak and why those efforts so far have failed. Justin Revenaugh, professor of earth science, geology, and geophysics at the University of Minnesota, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Thank you.
What is BP doing to stop the oil from gushing in the Gulf, and why hasn't the company been able to stop it so far?
Well, right now they have a cap on top of what's called a riser, which is just a giant pipe extending up from the seafloor. And that is pulling in oil, but it's not firmly attached to the riser. And as a result, it pulls in seawater as well. And at those pressures and depths, seawater and methane in the oil combine to make an ice. And so they have to pump methanol down there to keep it from freezing up and bring in extra seawater as well to keep it warm. Maybe half to perhaps as much as 3/4 of the oil coming out of the riser is still escaping to the sea.
And there was a bit of a setback today, the day we're recording this interview, where an underwater robot struck a venting device. Tell us what happened with that, and now we understand the oil is gushing at an even greater rate.
Right, so the robot bumped into the cap, and they had to remove the cap to make sure that the vent system on it was still intact. And again, that vent is really there just to keep it from freezing up with ice.
When does this all come to an end? Do you think this will be capped by the end of summer?
That's the hope. So BP right now is drilling 2 separate wells nearby, and they're going to try to intersect the gusher, the one that's producing this spill right now, at depth. And when they do that, they'll be able to do that. Then they'll be able to inject the mud that they tried to do before from the surface to overcome the pressure of the oil at depth, and then actually cement in this one and prevent it from leaking anymore.
Talk about the use of mud. I found that interesting. I heard it was mud, golf balls. It seemed like there was a lot of debris being tossed in. It was an interesting way of capping it.
Yeah, so the different processes using different materials. So the mud is basically just a mix of clays and rock fragments and water. And the reason you use it is you're trying to get something that's sufficiently dense that when you pump it into the well, it can keep the oil, which is buoyant, down. The oil is sitting down there, it's trapped, it's being pressurized by the weight of the rock above it. And so you need to get something that's fairly dense to keep it down. And so that's why they use the mud. The golf balls and shreds of tires and whatnot were an attempt to clog up the blowout preventer sitting on the seafloor. It's a big valve and has a number of portals through it. You can pump small things into it, but the exit out is a much bigger diameter. And so they try and come up with odd shapes that you can get in through a small diameter tube and will eventually clog up a much larger diameter tube.
Now, we hear so much about why this process is difficult, and a lot of it is blamed upon technology or the lack of technology. But then you hear things like using tires and golf balls, and it seems awfully low-tech. Is part of the reason why this is taking so long just the fact that it's not all that easy to plug up a hole, despite what many of us think it should be?
Right, it's not all that easy. And where they're doing it is not all that common. Blowout on the deep sea floor is rare, thankfully. It hasn't happened at this magnitude before. And so a lot of the technology was developed when oil exploration was sort of the way we remember it from the 50s movies, Giant with James Dean, drilling out in the back of the big ranch and hitting a gusher and eventually screwing down the cap. Well, it's not like that anymore. The magnitude of the processes is a lot bigger, but a lot of the technology is a hangover from that. It's improved, but it's based around those old ideas of clogging up a valve with junk, which is why they called it a junk shot, because it literally is junk that they're injecting.
There's been a lot of criticism about BP's response to this leak. Why didn't the company respond in a more timely manner?
They're not able to. It's pure and simple. When you look at the major oil companies, their deep sea drilling response plans were all drafted by the same third-party company. They all contain just terrible anachronisms talking about the industry as it was 20 years ago. They're clearly taken from other places than just the Gulf. And the estimates were lowballed as to how bad the worst case scenario could be. Now, that in itself is sort of a shame that the plan really wasn't produced by the companies who are responsible for executing it. And secondly, it's not a response plan in the sense of what do we do when something goes wrong. It's more a discussion of what happens when something goes wrong. It's more of a disaster plan in a sense. You know, how bad will this be? How large an area will be affected? And the portions of it devoted to how do we stop it really are just not there.
Well, the errors and the outright inaccuracies in the plan, such as protecting the walruses that don't exist in the Gulf, that certainly doesn't inspire a lot of confidence when someone thinks that that plan was something a company with the resources that BP has would rely upon. Should we have cause for concern about other oil companies? Are their plans going to be as
Well, they have the same
antiquated as
plan.
this? The same plan?
It's the same plan. Yeah, the covers are different because the company name on the front is different, but it's effectively the same plan. We should be concerned, but it's a concern that extends further than the oil companies. There's a federal agency, the MMS, which is in charge of regulating this activity, and they accepted these plans.
In an ideal world, what would a better response have looked like?
Well, to me, a better response would be having the ships that you need to siphon the oil at the surface and to skim the water out, and the burners, because they burn a lot of what comes up, in the Gulf, not in the North Sea and having to steam there, or not in the Middle East and having to steam here. Having containment systems built, not being built after the fact and having to be engineered, then built, then transported out, and then waiting for the ship that can handle the oil it siphons. None of that should have been a waiting game. Those things should have been sitting in a dock in the Gulf, ready to go.
We hear a lot of criticism along the lines of we can land men on the moon, and we did that the first time over 40 years ago,
Yeah.
yet we can't plug a hole in an oil well in the ocean.
Yeah.
Is that a fair question to bring up?
It is, but think about how we got men to the moon. There was a series of incremental missions, some of which ended badly. People died and missions failed. And we eventually got there. And it was sort of a baby step to giant step to one giant leap progression that got us there. In the oil industry, we've been moving to deeper and deeper water, largely without incident in the U.S. And because of that, the ability to respond to what might happen hasn't developed. People get cocky when things go well for a while. You assume they will continue to go well. And so we have the ability to drill out there, but we didn't simultaneously develop the ability to handle calamity out there.